Welcome to this episode of the Viking Virtual Resident Historian. It's part of our ongoing cultural enrichment program and our commitment to destination-focused learning. A series that takes you further with unique perspectives and intriguing insights. It analyzes and puts into context important chapters of world history. The Viking Virtual Resident Historian puts history at your fingertips. We hope you'll find this episode enriching.
Hello, I'm Charles Doherty. Today's lecture is on the history of the Netherlands. We'll address the amazing history of one of Europe's smaller countries whose determination to tackle issues of land use and management allowed them to attain achievements far beyond what one might expect from such a relatively small population. This is the first of two lectures. Today we'll discuss early Dutch history and consider the people and events up to and including the early 17th century. This lecture is subtitled The Miracle of the Lowlands. The second lecture, concerning the glories of the 17th century up to the present, is subtitled The Golden Age and After. In order to tell the Dutch story, we'll touch upon many aspects of environmental and economic history that will fuel their now universally recognized achievements in both art and cultural history, not to mention urban history as well. As we'll see, their practices of land management, reclaiming the land through use of dikes and harnessing the power of wind will lead to their preeminent role as the economic powerhouse of the 17th century. As you can see, here is our roadmap for the topics to be addressed over the course of both lectures. Today, we'll first set the stage, placing the Netherlands in some form of context within the European sphere. We'll examine the Dutch as skillful traders and explorers, focusing our attention on how their outward-looking curiosity and entrepreneurial skills will lead to the formation of the Dutch East India Company that will produce untold riches. We'll also address the Spanish Netherlands, as she was called, when under the auspices of Spain, which will precipitate the Dutch revolt. In part 2 of our history of the Netherlands, we'll pick up from here. As her economic power is on the ascendancy, coupled with her growing confidence, both components helping create her most extraordinary golden age. Furthermore, we'll consider more recent Dutch history as well, outlining the country's role during various periods of war and conflict during the 19th and 20th centuries. And lastly, spend a few moments to consider the important role of Holland within the European Union today. As you can see, this is our roadmap for part 1 of our lecture today. We'll start with setting the stage, covering some of the geographic and demographic components for appreciating Dutch history, before considering some of the earliest visitors to Holland, the Romans and the Vikings. But before we begin, we need to differentiate the use of these two familiar names for the country, the Netherlands and Holland. The official name of the country is the Kingdom of the Netherlands, with King Willem-Alexander, the king of the nation. The term Holland, however, is really more of a geographic term and technically refers to only two provinces, Noord-Holland and Zuid-Holland, essentially the two provinces of North Holland and South Holland. But the term Holland is often used to describe the entire country, and for our purposes, we'll use both of these terms interchangeably, the Netherlands and Holland, to refer to the entire country throughout this lecture. The word Dutch, by the way, stems from an Old English word meaning people or nation. The same word Dutch would also morph into Deutschland for the name of Germany. Turning to the map and the statistics you see on the screen, Holland lies on the North Sea with many islands and inlets. It's largely an urban country with a population today of just over 17 million. However, her population within contemporary Europe is interesting. She's in the middle tier of European countries by size, yet fewer than 3% of all Europeans are Dutch. Economically, notice the wealth of the Dutch today, with a GDP per capita of around $53,900. This means they are the third most prosperous among all EU members based upon GDP per capita. A few other features from the map to point out. First, you can see the well-known cities of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, but also notice the location of Wieringen, where the Vikings enter our story, and the city of Delft, that we'll examine more closely in due course. Also notice the location of the Rhine River on the right side of the map, entering from Germany before dissecting the Netherlands and flowing to the North Sea. Although there have been people living in these lowlands of northeastern Europe going back some 100,000 years, it will be the Romans who will first record details of the early tribes of the region, shown within the map on the right. They were identified by Julius Caesar. However, it may come as no surprise that Caesar wasn't much into anthropological details or social history to include aspects of their tribal customs or ways of life. Arriving around 600 BC, these tribal people lived mainly in the most northern and eastern parts, as these areas of higher ground were the only portions inhabitable. Unfortunately, no written records by them survive, so our earliest stories about them come from Greek and Roman writers. And it will be Roman artifacts that will be the earliest archaeological objects recovered on Dutch soil. Roman occupation lasted for some 450 years, from the 1st century BC up until the early 5th century AD. The Rhine River will mark the northernmost flank of the Roman Empire, a boundary established around the year 12 AD. Their presence will spawn the creation of many towns along the river. Notice the bronze mask of a Roman horseman on the left, discovered at the bottom of a river near Leiden, only coming to light in 1996. Such a mask, worn perhaps by a Roman horseman in battle, would have frightened one's opponents, or may have been worn in ceremonial parades to give one the persona of a Roman god. By the way, the helmet was hinged, allowing the horseman to temporarily lift it off his face in order to breathe. Many such artifacts, including statuettes, coins, pottery, and the like, are regularly discovered during excavation work across these portions of southern Holland. It will be the emerging power of the Franks, a Germanic warrior group who will eventually assume control of the region as Roman power dissipates in the 4th century. The Franks will predominate during these intermediate centuries, formerly known as the Dark Ages, those darker 6th to 9th centuries before the full development of the medieval era. We know, however, that the Vikings will explore many portions of the Netherlands during the 9th and 10th centuries, and a resistance to their incursions conducted by local nobles was often futile when up against the power of the Vikings. Notice in the small inset map in the upper right indicating Friesland, an area of most interest to the Vikings. The Frisian and Frankish towns here were defenseless, their people rather naive and ill-equipped to withstand the might of their Viking visitors. The Vikings, however, were mainly interested in establishing outposts. Neither were they prone to settling in large numbers, nor were they really interested in permanent settlements. Rorik of Dorstad, the Danish Viking depicted here in a rather romanticized image of 100 years ago, is from one of the most important Viking families settling in Holland. Rorik ruled portions of Friesland in the mid-9th century, conquering Dorstad and Utrecht in 850. He would eventually swear allegiance to the German King Louis in 873, and it's believed that he would die sometime within the decade to follow. Some scholars surmise that he was associated with the archaeological treasure that you see on the right. This silver hoard, only discovered in 1996 through use of a metal detector, was found in an overturned 9th century cooking pot, containing the equivalent of almost 4 pounds, or about 1.7 kilograms, of Carolingian and Arab coins, bracelets, and silver ingots. It was worth a huge sum in its day, enough even to buy a large farm with cattle and serfs. But it wouldn't be until the year 920 AD when King Henry of Germany came to the aid of the city of Utrecht, when Viking supremacy would come to an end. Having set the stage for putting early Dutch history in some form of context, we must now consider just how and why the Dutch expanded their interests, both as traders and explorers, to acquire both goods and lands from virtually all corners of the known globe. In order to appreciate the importance of Dutch trade to our story, we first need to consider economic life in Holland prior to the 16th century, when much larger vessels will take to the oceans. Or more specifically, consider what Dutch trade was like when both products and trading partners were much closer to home. We turn to the schematic map showing many of the cities participating in the Hanseatic League. The League was important in the 14th and 15th centuries, significant in those decades prior to the establishment of monarchies and royal navies and the like. This loosely configured network of largely German towns and cities took it upon themselves to organize trade of locally sourced goods with both their near neighbors, but also with Europeans and Russians connected via inland rivers and the open seas, some great distances apart. At its height, the Hanseatic League involved as many as 100 different localities, as shown here, reaching from modern-day Belgium in the lower left of the screen, all the way to areas of modern-day Russia on the far right. Goods moved via the Baltic cog, a newly configured vessel that would ply the waters of the North Sea and Baltic, often under quite harsh conditions. If the high seas and turbulent weather weren't enough as obstacles, it might be the rampant piracy common along the Baltic shores, and sometimes even pirates commissioned by one's fellow Hanseatic League members. Thus, it was a quasi-workable, yet at times inefficient and unreliable means of moving goods and staples. Among the goods traded by the Dutch, they sent out salt and cloth, along with different food and drink products. Their imports ranged from practical staples like grain, flax, and hemp, to things like timber and tar and charcoal, but also luxuries such as Flemish cloth, even whale oil or herring, sourced from Norway and Sweden. However, the advance in Dutch prosperity would reach a plateau by the late 1400s, when the importance of the Hanseatic League would slowly be eroded by traders with much grander endeavors. As we'll see, a definition of a prosperous household will be in flux as more and more of these valuable luxury goods, such as silk and tea and porcelain and spices, will be sourced via ocean-going vessels going to and from the Far East, providing things far more exotic than tar, charcoal, or even Flemish cloth. Before we launch into these greatly expanding horizons for Dutch trade, we need to consider what trade was like prior to the early 16th century. How did Europeans attain those Asian luxury goods and spices? This map delineates two separate modes for Asian-European trade, routes shown here in red when trade was overland, and later in blue when trade was largely via maritime routes. First in red, note what's often referred to as the Silk Road. This was a series of various way stations spanning altogether some 7,000 miles across two continents for the trading of silk and other fine cloth, but spices, precious metals, and gemstones. Transport was largely via the backs of camels, rather obstreperous and cantankerous animals, even on a good day. For those of you who have ever had the experience of riding one, such an arduous and labor-intensive journey was fraught with disruptions due to shifting sands in the desert, military conflicts, let alone the vagaries of having so many intermediaries along the journey. It's a wonder that any goods ever made their way intact, traveling those thousands of miles between Xi'an in China to, let's say, Constantinople in Turkey, and then beyond to Western Europe. Next, in blue, in the center of the map, please note what might be called a spice route, these largely maritime routes for ships carrying precious cargo. This will largely replace the Silk Road. Under the Portuguese prince, Henry the Navigator, Vasco da Gama would first chart a course down the west coast of Africa in the late 1490s. The Portuguese would undercut the Venetians as profiteering middlemen for bringing luxury goods from Constantinople to the rest of Europe. And the Dutch, too, will seize upon the quest to find maritime routes to the Far East, as we'll soon discover. But may I offer a sneak peek of what lies ahead in going out on a limb to create the following metaphor? Amsterdam will be built on nothing but pylons of nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon, with an occasional accent of peppercorn. The tremendous bounty derived from the Dutch monopoly of the European spice trade will spawn their miraculous golden age. So this begs the important question: how could Holland, being such a small country, a mere dwarf in comparison with neighbors England and France, make this happen? But first, we need to consider how the Dutch would enter this new world of exploration and discovery during the century before their golden age. We turn to Willem Barents, an important Dutch navigator and cartographer whose 3 expeditions largely focused upon a search for the Northeast Passage, this elusive path from Europe to Asia via a route across the top of modern-day Canada. His first attempt in the late 16th century sought a more efficient path to those Asian luxury goods and spices, a path to outrival his fellow Spanish and Portuguese mariners. You see on the screen not only maps of Barents's attempts, his first voyage around the year 1594 in the upper left, and his third, just a few years later, shown in the lower left. For our purposes, Barents is largely remembered for 3 things. First, as the skillful cartographer, he was among the first to chart these most northern waters, also recording valuable meteorological data long before other Arctic explorers. Second, he lost his life during that 3rd expedition in the year 1597, when his ship was trapped in sea ice. Notice the imagined image in the upper right. He survived only a week. However, his crew eventually managed to escape via open waters. As well, we see an evocative portrayal of his crew fighting off polar bears in the lower right. Lastly, he was remembered because of his name associated with the Barents Sea. This is the body of water above Norway and Russia, or the marginal sea of the Arctic Ocean, reaching the northernmost portions of Europe. It will be named after him in the 19th century. But his expeditions demonstrate the feverish interest of the Dutch early on in reaching the Far East. And remember, this is the dawn of the 17th century, just prior to the dramatic changes that will overtake the entire country. Among such significant Dutch advances during the early years of the 17th century was the creation of the Dutch East India Company, whose name in Dutch forms the initials VOC, the shorthand acronym for talking about the organization. You see their logo in the upper center of the screen. Begun in 1602, under the auspices of Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, represented in the upper left, it began as an expansion scheme for a wide variety of Dutch commercial interests. At first, the government granted the VOC trading rights for the southern tip of Africa. Here, they could negotiate their own treaties and terms with the local princes, build forts in order to secure their ports, and in the end, function in many ways similar to an actual governmental body. Eventually, the VOC's commercial interests expand to include key ports in modern-day India and China, often at the expense of the Portuguese. They were in the forefront in the production of maps as well, said to have their own secret atlases for their expeditions. And in a matter of decades, the VOC would establish ports throughout much of Southeast Asia, as we'll see. So we have to ask, just how large was this maritime powerhouse? At its peak, some 100 years after its founding, the VOC had 150 merchant vessels, protected by 40 fighting ships and 10,000 soldiers. Note the map from this year, 1700, shown on the right. It documents the breadth and range of their trading interests on all sides of the Indian Ocean. Chronologically, let's trace briefly their growing ascendancy on the world stage. In 1619, just 17 years after they were founded, work began on building an operations base at Batavia, today Jakarta in Indonesia, that we'll discuss later at greater length. And in no time, the VOC managed to monopolize the trade in spices sourced from mysterious places in the Far East, demonstrating their commercial prowess far superior to most other seafaring European countries. And perhaps it's only the English East India Company, with their ever-expanding foothold on the Indian subcontinent, and to a lesser extent Portugal, only these two European powers might be seen as their only true rivals. Additionally, we need to distinguish two features of the Dutch East India Company that demonstrate their pioneering role in business history. As the first truly transnational corporation, the VOC is recognized by many scholars as the earliest example of corporate globalization. They were the first to operate on different continents, Africa and Asia to name two, but they also hired people who were not Dutch. For example, other Europeans from Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany, but Asians as well. Their corporate interest in building a diverse workforce utilizing local talent was so way ahead of their time. And second, they were the first business organization in the world to issue shares as investment options for outsiders to participate in their business missions. Note the image in the lower left of one such bond issued by the VOC. It dates from the year 1623. Having shareholders would minimize potential losses due to pirates whose own networks and cunning ways were endemic across the VOC waters. And recall my mention of 40 fighting ships and 10,000 soldiers as employees? Such fighting ships and armed personnel attempted to ensure the safe passage of valuable cargo. But the true success of the VOC as a limited liability company might come from the following statistic. They managed to pay an annual dividend of 18% for almost 200 years. Pioneers in the history of business, indeed. So the world is opening up greatly, but we need to look back and consider two 17th century explorers for the VOC cause, one going west and the other east. Their expeditions allow much insight into the early workings and ambitions of the Dutch East India Company. The first expedition was led by Henry Hudson. And yes, your memory is correct. He was an English sailor, sailing for his own country 3 times, but once, in the year 1609, he was part of a very important Dutch mission. Note the map on the right, the red line and arrows indicating his Dutch journey of 1609, while the purple line and arrows correspond to his last and what will prove fatal expedition of 1610-11. Within the Dutch government's charter to the Dutch East India Company were 2 important goals in this year 1609. First, to find this new but seemingly elusive route to the Indies via the Arctic Ocean, and second, to claim any uncharted lands he happened to come upon on behalf of the Dutch government. Hudson is best remembered in Dutch history for just that. He added portions of modern-day Canada and the United States under these governmental directives. And while undertaking his primary goal to discover the Northwest Passage to Asia, he managed to sail up that river near modern-day Manhattan. No, not the East River, the Hudson, which would be named after him. Furthermore, there will also be a famous bay named after him, Hudson Bay, and a strait, Hudson Strait. The strait is marked at the top of this map, the link between the Labrador Sea and Hudson Bay. Upon his eventual return to Holland later in 1609, Hudson was the first to refer to this region of North America as New Netherlands. The Dutch government would grant him exclusive trading rights for a region that spanned as far south as the English colony of Virginia and as far north as the French one in Quebec. But to give you an inkling of the rest of the story, it was Hudson's feverish quest to discover this Northwest Passage that ultimately led to his death during his expedition of 1610-11. His fatal mistake while navigating Hudson Bay was to sail south towards James Bay, shown here on the map, at the southernmost part of the bay. Eventually getting trapped in winter ice, he was locked in for the dark, cold winter months. And later reports of his last expedition included tales of his rather headstrong nature, accusations of hoarding food at the expense of his crew, even leading to quarrels and acts of violence among crew members, and an eventual mutiny by the majority of his crew. His demise is evocatively envisioned in this late 19th century painting shown in the lower left, titled The Last Voyage of Henry Hudson by John Collier. And, perhaps tugging a bit too hard upon those Victorian heartstrings of its viewers, it depicts Hudson along with his young son and one crew member, all forced adrift in a small boat following the mutiny of his crew. He nor his small crew and boat were ever found. Regardless of his inability to discover the Northwest Passage, his important role in Dutch history includes valuable geographical charting undertaken of both Canada and the American Northeast, and his acquisition of territory in these regions, which will eventually lead to the Dutch colonization of New York. All of this accomplished during one mission for the Dutch government in 1609. Again, in context, recall, this is only 7 years after the formation of the Dutch East India Company. So right out of the gate, the Dutch were making land acquisitions that would prove fruitful as the century would transpire. While Henry Hudson's 1609 westward expedition led to the exploration of North America, other Dutch East India Company endeavors looked east, including the 2 voyages of Abel Tasman. Note the map on the left. In red, Tasman's first expedition, occurring some 33 years after Hudson's, involved exploration of the Indian Ocean, Australasia, and those parts of the southern Pacific shown here. In green, on his second voyage in 1644, he focused more upon the north coast of Australia, along with the islands of modern Indonesia. And his claim to fame? He will be the first European to sight Tasmania, New Zealand, Tonga, and the Fiji Islands. During this expedition, he would also circumnavigate Australia without ever stepping foot on it, let alone even seeing it. But he ascertained that this land was clearly separated from what was thought to be a southern continent, a concept dating back to the ancient geographer Ptolemy, who suggested the existence of one large continent that embraced both Australia and Antarctica. It was Tasman and later Captain James Cook who laid this conception of a southern continent to rest. But Tasman's instructions from the Dutch East India Company for his 1644 expedition, including his sailing south of the ordinary trade route to explore the Indian Ocean from west to east, but to proceed further eastward, perhaps as far as Chile, attempting to ascertain whether this might become a viable route for future use. But in the end, Tasman was a great disappointment to the VOC. First, for not ever reaching Chile in order to assess the region's viability as a trade route. But second, he would come back twice, largely empty-handed. His assessment of the lands he visited, he said, nothing profitable, only some naked beach runners and some rice. Well, as his journeys didn't reveal the lands for lucrative exploitation that the VOC shareholders had become accustomed to, and after a few other minor assignments in parts of Asia, Abel Tasman would disappear from their record books and the history books by the year 1650. But his voyages mark the end as well of the VOC's exploration for new territories. They agreed to be content with their holdings and the wealth generated from their ever-lucrative East Indies spice trade. But yet, Tasman's story demonstrates an important reminder our school books, and much of this lecture focuses upon the great success stories. And yes, the historical record tends to omit and at times avoid discussions of failure or the woulda, coulda, shoulda sort of discussions. In the end, it's important to remember how few explorers actually discover the great bounty, those Eldorados of gold and precious goods. And the historical record is often devoid of those who came back empty-handed, as well overlooking the hardship and sacrifice of many lives along with their stories lost at sea. Yet it's Abel Tasman's name, it must be noted, that is familiar to us because of the Australian island Tasmania, but also then by default the name given to the island's idiosyncratic critter, the Tasmanian devil, shown in the lower right. This dog-sized carnivorous marsupial, renowned for his loud screeching voice, not to mention ferocious nature while feeding, has another claim to fame. He possesses one of the strongest animal bites per body mass among all in the animal kingdom. And maybe this is indeed Abel Tasman's last laugh, a rather curious, lasting legacy of his expeditions, largely disappointing to the VOC. Underappreciated by his Dutch East India Company colleagues, the Tasman name, ironically, is better known and more synonymous with the land down under than virtually every one of his VOC colleagues whose names are completely lost to us. Once more, maybe this is indeed Tasman's last laugh, with his Tasmanian devil's ferociousness living on. Additionally, the Dutch 17th century progressed with numerous success stories around the globe involving colonization, including a few settlements. A few minutes ago, we outlined Henry Hudson's contributions, including his claim of portions of the American Northeast and Canada for Holland. Note, for example, the two maps in the upper left. The map in the upper center shows those areas identified as New Netherlands, a term first used by Henry Hudson in 1609. The other map in the upper left corner shows the extent of the Dutch North American colonies and how they expanded by the year 1656. Within this area, important trading posts were established, particularly at the bottom of the Hudson River, whose open waters provided movement of goods throughout most of the year. So why was the trade in furs, especially beaver pelts, so valued in Europe? It's because the pelts could be felted, made into felted panels for highly prized waterproof hats. Within the Americas to the south, there will also be late 16th century Dutch settlements in Guyana, which was settled more than 10 years before the Dutch settlement in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta. Unlike many other European colonizers in the New World, such as Spain or Portugal, France or England, the Dutch lacked some of their fellow Europeans' fervor for actually settling, digging in their heels, and retaining their land. With the exception of Suriname and Netherlands Antilles and half of St. Martin, most of the Dutch colonial holdings were either taken from them or abandoned by the late 17th century. However, there were also Dutch settlements in Brazil, especially in the northeast portion of the country, with the Dutch West Indies Company settling up their headquarters in the city of Recife. But most importantly, we need to turn our attention to the portraits on the right, in which a Dutch artist captures the likeness of an African mother and child of Brazil. Here we must address an important component of our story. Such crucial topics, such as slavery, shouldn't be marginalized and certainly shouldn't go undiscussed in such overly romanticized and perhaps sentimental portrayals of Africans as shown here. By the year 1650, Holland was the largest slave trader of all European countries. Remember, virtually all countries of the world were participants in the slave trade in one way or another, including countries in Africa, so it shouldn't be a great surprise that economically savvy Holland would be left out of this lucrative yet horrible trade in human beings. Thus, we must acknowledge that part of Amsterdam's wealth after the year 1619, when they entered the trading of slaves, came as a result of human slavery. Her Dutch port alone had almost 10,000 vessels associated with the movement of slaves, who were first retained from 10 fortresses along Ghana's Gold Coast. In the early years, most slaves were destined for northern Brazil. Eventually, others would go to Suriname and Guyana, while others still would be sent to harvest the spices in the East Indies. So it was truly a global enterprise. The Netherlands retained this most unfortunate accolade as the leading slave nation until the year 1700, when the British assumed the title. Although scholars estimate that the Dutch were only responsible for an estimated 5 to 7% of all European transatlantic slaves, this still adds up to a figure of some 550 to 600,000 men, women, and children. I might add that the Netherlands, along with the United States, were among the last countries to abolish slavery, the Dutch, in the year 1863. It would thus be a disservice to history were we to ignore the important contributions of the slaves in building the VOC, the harvesting of crops in the East Indies, the building of Dutch cities and their infrastructure projects, not to mention their role in developing and supporting Dutch colonies around the world during the 17th century. But the Dutch weren't just making their mark upon the Americas. In the upper left, notice a 19th century rendition of Jan van Riebeeck, the Dutch colonial administrator, landing at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652. The southern tip of the continent would eventually grow into an important supply site for outfitting Dutch ships about to traverse the Indian or Atlantic Oceans. The VOC had no initial interest in colonization here. Rather, they sought an outpost for sheltering their crews from storms, feeding hungry sailors before resupplying their ships with meat, fruit, and vegetables for onward journeys in either direction. At first, some of the VOC employees were allowed to stay to farm the land in order to meet the need for more and more fresh produce. And in time, the Dutch also began to grow wheat, make wine, and eventually raise livestock. The VOC, in recognizing a greater potential for their venture, would send a group of Huguenots in 1687. These were the French Protestants who had escaped persecution in Catholic France, some having fled to the Netherlands. The region would, in due course, become the city of Cape Town, and the map in the lower left documents the expansion of their Dutch Cape colony over the course of the 18th century. At its beginnings, note the small red dot in the year 1700 to its expanded yellow portions on the map at the end of the century. But let's also turn our attention eastward and consider the establishment of settlements throughout the Dutch East Indies, as shown within the map in the lower right. For brevity's sake, the red represents the late 18th century holdings, the orange and yellow the 19th century, and the olive green marks the extent of the Dutch possessions by the year 1920. But to return to our chronology of 17th century comparisons, note the artist's rendition of the Dutch settlement at Batavia in the upper right. While the Dutch were settling in the southern Cape, they were also establishing an important port where Jakarta is today. It would be laid out as a colonial enclave, replete with quasi-European, Western European architecture, or let's say Dutch architecture with more of an Asian twist. Once a swampy, inhospitable, malaria-laden portion of the north coast of Java, Batavia became Operation Central for all VOC trading interests in Asia. Initially, for the monopolizing control of indigenous nutmeg, black pepper, cloves, and cinnamon, but later in the movement of non-indigenous cash crops such as sugar, coffee, cacao, rubber, and opium. But in returning home to Holland, we need to consider the political history of the Netherlands, more specifically addressing what the country was like, let's say, prior to the year 1500. As part of a group of states referred to as the Low Countries, comprising today the modern countries of Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, these regions were under the thumb of the Holy Roman Empire. Before the establishment of monarchies or royal navies and the consolidation of national powers, the Holy Roman Empire existed as an amorphous body for some 1,000 years, overseeing much of northern Europe from a base in Aachen, a city today along the modern German-Belgian border. Although a pervasive entity, the Holy Roman Empire really held little political clout. It's in this context we realize just how these lowland states, after the year 1556, were held in personal union with the Spanish crown. Parts of modern northern France and western Germany were also beholden to Spain. There were 17 provinces altogether that were eventually passed on as the Habsburg Netherlands to the Spanish Hamburgs, occurring with the abdication of the Habsburg Emperor Charles V in this year 1556. The Spanish King Philip II, seen on the left, was the principal figure in controlling the Spanish Netherlands from the mid-16th century. And there were numerous economic challenges for his country, including 5 state bankruptcies in less than 40 years. During this time, the devout and most pious Catholic Philip considered himself the defender-in-chief of all Catholic Europe, feeling increasingly threatened by the Ottoman Turks and Islam to his east, and the rise of Protestantism after Martin Luther and the Reformation earlier in the 16th century. Protestantism, too, was growing in popularity in the Netherlands, and it's within this context the Dutch rebellion will evolve, culminating in the 80 Years' War that we will examine more closely. Remember, Philip will later exercise his will to repel the growing threat of Protestant England in waging the fierce naval battle usually referred to as the Spanish Armada in the year 1588. But meanwhile, William of Orange, shown in the center, who was also known as William the Silent or William the Taciturn, will become the main leader of the Dutch revolt. Note the 19th century painting on the right, imagining the interaction of Philip II berating William the Silent on the deck in Flushing as Philip was departing the Netherlands. Such humiliation is legendary in Dutch culture, and for many today, William of Orange is seen as the father of the fatherland for his courage in standing up to Philip despite being the victim of both torment and patronizing behavior. Now, with a growing sense of her potential stature on the world stage, Holland's fervor will spearhead the Dutch revolt that initiates the 80 Years' War. Beginning in 1568, the Dutch will take on the Spanish Habsburgs, and what follows will be Holland's finest hour, or rather finest century, the 17th century, her golden age, a chapter of Dutch history almost unique in all of Europe. And one component of their extraordinary success that we need to address, the small size of Holland. For example, in the year 1600, at the dawn of her golden age, the Dutch population is estimated at 1.5 million people, when neighboring England was 5.6 million, and France had some 20 million. Or the population of Holland is around 1/4 the size of England, and only 1/13 the size of France. This begs the question, how could such a small country with such a low population in comparison with their neighbors attain such extraordinary wealth and such prominence in so little time? Part of the answer to this question lies with the Dutch rising up against the Spanish. In some ways, it might appear akin to a David and Goliath story. Prior to the Dutch revolt, William had served his Spanish Habsburg rulers dutifully as one of the governors of the Spanish Netherlands. However, the gradual removal of power taken from the various local Dutch states, along with the growing persecution of local Protestants, not to mention Philip's raising of local taxes, all of these became too much for William to condone. He will convert to Calvinism, this Protestant offshoot of Lutheranism, and the 80 Years' War was on. We might call this Holland's War of Independence against the Spanish Habsburgs. And 2 significant chapters of the war deserve our attention. First, the creation of the Union of Utrecht, resulting from a treaty signed in 1579 that unified the northern provinces of the Netherlands. It's regarded as the foundation of the 7 united provinces, one of the stepping stones towards the creation of a country separate from Spain. It essentially divided those Protestant provinces of the north from the Roman Catholic ones in the south, provinces aligned with Catholic Spain. It's significant in world history as the Treaty of Utrecht might be seen as the first to allow for tolerance of personal religious beliefs, the freedom to worship as one chose, independent of state authority. But the next year, in 1580, the Spanish king would declare William of Orange an outlaw, and he would be assassinated just 4 years later in Delft in 1584. Next, I need to point out the importance of the Battle of Nieuwpoort of 1600, whose heroic rendition is recorded in this grand history painting depicting Maurice of Nassau, the Dutch commander of the army. The lesson learned at the Battle of Nieuwpoort was one of strategic advantage. It was much more important to besiege towns and defeat the population centers rather than just winning territory in the open countryside and then having to control it as the war progressed. This war strategy of defeating population centers would define and characterize the 80 Years' War thereafter. And the eventual securing of the Dutch border followed 9 years later in 1609 during what is known as the 12 Years' Truce. After the 12 Years' Truce, the fighting would continue, and the next phase developed after the year 1621, during what came to be known as the 30 Years' War. It wouldn't be until 1648 when Spain finally recognized the existence of an independent Dutch republic. We won't have a chance to address so many of the border changes and various divisions of provinces as they carved out their loyalties, each establishing themselves as independent from their Spanish rulers over these years. However, let's try to summarize this in a nutshell. The Netherlands would be a republic in Europe between 1588 and 1795, as you see at the top of the screen. Before this, in the year 1581, there was a republic of the 7 united Netherlands, whose territories are shown here within this map. Also included was the region of Drenthe in the upper right. And it's the 7 united Netherlands that will be the predecessor state of modern Netherlands. This first lecture today has spanned some 1,600 years of Dutch history, beginning with the early settlements of the Romans and the Vikings. They were pioneers in the history of business, setting up the Dutch East India Company, the first truly transcontinental global business enterprise, in which they issued shares as a means of attracting investors. They were also ahead of their time, seeking a multinational workforce for overseeing their operations. Sometimes, however, with the vital yet unfortunate participation of African slaves. The VOC's role as economic powerhouse will lead to their monopolization of the spice trade, as we'll witness during the next lecture, and following the Dutch revolt and banishing the shackles of Catholic Spain, Holland would expand her presence on the world stage, not only as economic traders, but as a European colonial power as well. I've included this overview as a teaser. From here, our story continues in part 2, the history of the Netherlands, the Golden Age and after. The screen isolates 4 key components that will fuel their Golden Age. The Dutch people. How might we summarize the Dutch and their worldview that directs us toward an understanding of their century, the 17th century, and also about their geography, the land, and harnessing its full potential, thus leading to an examination of their available resources. And lastly, elaborating a bit further about their economic prowess, allowing for the creation of the emblems of prosperity, as we'll call them. How might this economic powerhouse be directly linked with the extraordinary accomplishments across all of the sciences and arts? The Dutch people will be blessed with a cornucopia of wealth as a result of their labors, a prosperity that the art historian Simon Schama has called an embarrassment of riches. We'll demonstrate their harnessing of many factors that will produce a distinctly Dutch amalgam of prosperity and refinement. Please join us for the next exciting chapters of Dutch history from the 17th century and beyond. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Charles Doherty, the Chief Resident Historian for Viking Cruises. Many of you have come to know me over these previous weeks on Viking.TV, and hopefully when our paths cross someday on a Viking vessel, it will only be Charles. Please think of me as Charles. Anyway, it has been a interesting week, as we all know. Hopefully all of you are still doing well, spending a lot of time in self-isolation and or limiting one's adventures into nature. But with these longer days in the Northern Hemisphere, not to mention the warming up of temperatures, it does really help to be able to take a walk in nature and enjoy the bounty. I happen to have a bouquet of my tulips in honor of our Netherlandish lecture, and unfortunately I'm not certain if they would have held up for next week when we'll talk about the tulip craze and tulip mania. But anyway, I'll talk about those more at the end, along with the red sweater, which I thought needed to be explained. And again, I'll save that for the end. But first of all, I wanted to tackle three lovely questions that were sent in last time that we were together. And I think that they are curious enough that you will find them of interest as we just for a few minutes go back to the Italian Renaissance. First of all, Jerry in Kent, Ohio had asked, if you may recall, about being in Florence some years ago and seeing a building with a plaque to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was wondering, it was on a corner, and he was wondering what that was about and the reason for it. Well, it turns out, Jerry, that Longfellow was a translator as well as a poet and had done an important translation of Dante's Inferno that was published in, I think it was 1867. And in honor of his linguistic skills, his translator, as translator of Romance languages, that plaque in translation reads, American poet, consummate master of the Romance languages, translator of the Divine Comedy. But wait, there's more. It turns out that Longfellow as well wrote a poem called The Old Bridge at Florence, in which he then, I'm just reading a few stanzas, he writes as if speaking for the bridge talking. Taddeo Gaddi built me. I am old, 5 centuries old. I plant my foot of stone upon the Arno as St. Michael's own was planted on the dragon. And the poem ends, Florence adorns me with her jewelry, and when I think that Michelangelo hath leaned on me, I glory in myself. Hence that plaque, which appears on the Hotel Minerva in Piazza Santa Maria Novella, in that square there in Florence. Anyway, Jerry, sorry for the delay in getting back to you. I learned something as well. Next, you may recall Lene in Oslo. Thank you again for the great questions, Lene. Asked about why Leonardo da Vinci never painted eyebrows on the Mona Lisa and the rest. Well, as it turns out, doing some research online, there in 2007, there was a French engineer inventor who tackled this question by, he claimed to have blown up the image of the Mona Lisa 24 times, and he could detect some portion of a fine line indicating there once was a portion of an eyebrow. And surmising the fact that probably Leonardo did paint eyebrows on his female sitters, but by virtue of restoration campaign, they were probably light in nature, very indistinct. And the processes of time, aging, not to mention restoration, those eyebrows have probably been lost to us. So anyway, again, thank you for bringing that one to our attention, Lenny. And third, John in Incline Village. John is a pilot. We know this from previous questions. Had asked about the Wright brothers borrowing some of Leonardo da Vinci's designs. Did the Wright brothers know of these before their Wright flyer in 1903? Well, looking into this, as best I could find, there was a man who I'd never heard of, a Brit by the name of Sir George Cayley in 1809, who in discovering and working with some of Leonardo's ideas, he was studying lift and drag and the concept of a fixed wing airplane. So there were documents and obviously things for the Wright brothers to consult about early aerodynamics, but we don't know whether the Wright brothers in Kitty Hawk or nearby in a library ever saw one of those Leonardo plane designs. So again, it's always interesting when you look at history about who knew what when, and so oftentimes it's a matter of coincidence. Ancient Chinese terracotta pottery oftentimes takes on human proportions and the aspect of a neck and shoulders and feet and things that might be done in ancient Greece and let alone later in pre-Columbian civilizations, although they never knew of one another. There's sometimes just coincidences about tackling problems and meeting needs of functioning objects that there is a great similarity nevertheless. But turning to the questions of the day, there have been a whole bunch of great ones. Peter in Kelowna asks, why did Hudson sail for the VOC as opposed to continuing with the British? And great question. I assume that many of you, most of you watched that first part of the History of the Netherlands lecture, in which there was the map that showed that Hudson made 4 expeditions to, let's just call it, upper parts of North America, and both America and what would later become Canada. And the first 2 were sailing under the British flag. That third one in 1610 was Dutch, and then the fourth one, that fatal one, was again British. And it's important to put into the context that Henry Hudson would have had the best CV, the best resume, having completed these first 2 voyages in terms of understanding not just the problems and the associations with the weather and the currents, let alone the land masses, the uncertainty of how he might navigate. Again, it was all about that northeast passage, that magical sense of going over the top of the globe, essentially above modern day Canada, as opposed to going all the way south, the bottom of Africa, all the way to Southeast Asia to accumulate all those riches that were so sought after in the early 17th century. So I mentioned this because Hudson was the best qualified. He probably knew this area better than anyone since the Vikings, 500, 600, 700 years earlier. And so he was the best qualified. And you have to also remember that there was an affinity, an association between the Brits, the British, and the Dutch, because both were Protestant. Both had an agenda that was trying to overcome the powers and the importance of the Habsburg Spanish, Philip II and all that, which would later, end up in terms of the, Spanish Netherlands and then the revolt. So there would have been an affinity for these Protestant countries of Britain and the Netherlands to align themselves. And again, Hudson just happened to be at the right place at the right time. So Shar in Great Falls asked, so Barents was Dutch, and she was then asking a few other ancillary questions. But what was interesting, and I always re-watch the lectures the night before I do these, Monday nights for me is watching the lectures, and was reminded about how Barents is such an interesting character. And remember, in the lecture, perhaps you recall, there were 3 things he's famous for, not just as his cartography skills in the northern areas, but as well, he's remembered because of this very sad way he died. More about that in a moment. But the third one, of course, being his name applied to that sea above modern-day Norway, the Barents Sea. Well, what's interesting in piecing together aspects about that lecture is that I mentioned how some people are not in the history books, are forgotten, their stories lost to us. And what's so interesting about the Barents story, if I may just go on that way for a moment, he encountered ice in July. my European colleagues think, winters in Wisconsin are horrible, but, we don't have ice in July. I'm sorry. But anyway, all that aside, it required them, Barents and his crew members, to dismantle their wooden boat, to then construct some kind of shelter, like a house, in order to survive. Well, they did this, but after 10 months, not just cold winds, horrible temperatures, they didn't really have the weather required to rebuild a boat. And so they took off with two very simple kind of almost sledge-like things to then set sail. Barents only lasted 1 week before he died. But there were two surviving members of his team that did make it back to relate this story. So it is a real interesting chapter in Dutch history in that lead up to Hudson, and as well about the Dutch East India Company and explorations much further afield. Shar also asks, when did the landfill dike building begin? That's a teaser. You have to come back next week. We'll talk about that more, Shar, in part 2, if you don't mind. So let me just skip down here. Peter in Chicago asks, what is the relationship between the Dutch and the British East India Companies? Another great question. The obvious one is that the chronology is very similar and that they both share this portion of East India Company in their names, but they really are essentially two separate entities. And if I may chronologically do it for you, the British East India Company was kind of, the excitement came about after the Spanish Armada in 1588, the defeat of the Spanish, and then as well an important acquisition, if you will, of a Spanish ship in 1594, I think it was, that was laden with all of those amazing things, not just gold, silver, gems, jewels, frankincense. It was the whole kit and caboodle of riches, and that got everyone excited. And so it was in 1599, Queen Victoria then got things rolling, and I think the official charter was dating to 1600. I do this chronology because that's 2 years before the founding of the Dutch East India Company. And again, just in a general way, if I had to compare and contrast them, the British East India Company lasted longer into the 19th century. It also had a little bit more of a militaristic dimension, if I could use that term. The naval power and the associations with political hegemony associated with the various places that they were taking on. Remember that India, the acquisition of India, if I could use that term, the colonization of India was largely a tool of or a part of that British East India Company agenda. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't military components in the Dutch equivalent, but it's not, the Dutch weren't as acquisitive, as eager, as territorial conscious, if you will, as that British East India Company. If I may just go down an interesting road, I don't think anybody's asked this, but there's also a Dutch West Indies Company. And again, it was going to get too complicated to talk about this at length in our 45-minute lecture, but this was formed about, I think, 19 years after the Dutch East India. And so I think it was 1621. And it, as the name implies, was far more interested in going to the West. And it was what became the organization largely responsible for the slave trade. And again, thinking about that inclusion in this lecture, we want to make certain that the stories are not forgotten, and the fact that we're looking at history with a fresh 21st century eye. And we want to make certain that not just these stories aren't forgotten, but they're put into the context of how and why powers rise, succeed, and then as well where things start becoming frayed at the edges. And it was the Dutch West Indies Company that was bringing in not only Africans, I think it was 500,000 Africans from the West Coast into the Caribbean over a period of about 120 years. And only because I sketched out for you to try to explain the fact that, of course, there were the Portuguese who also had their own trading company. But I poached a map from one of our lectures, which is called the Age of Explorers, an important lecture that we do in the Caribbean to put it into context, not just Columbus, but all of the various European powers falling over themselves in search of that El Dorado and all of that gold that was purportedly, everywhere in Central and South America. Well, this map, I'm going to put it like that for you, shows what is known as the Tordesillas line, or after the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494. And I hope you can see, again, I'm sorry for the quality of our reproduction here, but I hope you can see that vertical line, which goes down as not quite the middle of the Atlantic, and then carves off that portion of Brazil that you see there kind of in the middle of the page. And what this is about is that the Spanish and the Portuguese had carved out the world according to their own needs and interests in 1494. So everything that was going to be to the west of that line would be Portuguese. Everything to the east of that line, sorry, I got it wrong. West of that line is Spanish. East of that line is Portuguese. And that's why Brazil today is Portuguese speaking, and much of Central America, South America is Spanish. So I mentioned this in the whole context of piecing these things together, that it's not just the English East India Company, the Dutch West India Company, the Portuguese and Spanish, let alone the French and others, all will have their sense of trying to carve up the new world. And it's largely about trade and luxury goods. Well, let me just see if I can find another one here for you. Janet in Evanston, hello Janet, asks, what languages were the early settlers speaking? An early French or German, question mark. Well, what's so interesting about your question, Janet, I was reading in one of my books that's now supporting my tulips behind me. I'll get back to them at the end when I'm talking about the further reading, but I was just reading about this last night, and about how it was a number of years before grammars or dictionaries were published for European traders on how to communicate with native people in North America. And so, as a tangent to your question, yes, they, Champlain and Cartier and the others would have been speaking French, and the Germans, Henry Hudson, presumably English. But the interesting dimension to your question about just reading it was the fact that it took time to have some kind of manual to facilitate the trading and the communications, which would have started out, of course, just being largely hand signals and body language. Let me see if I can find another one for you. Did that when I just refresh this one moment. Philip asks, will part 2 cover Operation Market Garden in World War II? My uncle was MIA, KIA in September of 1944. The Dutch were very helpful in locating his remains in 2017. Wow, Philip. What an amazing observation to share with us. Yes, essentially what we're going to be doing in that second half, we'll be picking up with the Golden Age, which will really be the visually rich component of these 2 lectures, talking about not just painting and architecture, but porcelain, pottery as well. But as well, we will go to and include portions of 20th century history, sometimes a bit less savory. And again, I mentioned this in a way about how these lectures are meant to accentuate the positive and about the uplifting aspects of what it is that has happened and what's been accomplished in this particular portion of the world. But, you know, we can't sweep things under the carpet as well. And that Dutch story involvement with the Second World War, we will talk about next week. And I'm not talking about just the Dyer Van Frank in the Anne Frank house, but really talking about how Prime Minister Rudd just last year, I believe it was, made a formal apology. Like I say, we'll talk more about that, Philip, next time. But thank you so much for writing in. Just thinking again about other things that might be on your mind. I noticed that the time is starting to wane here. There was mention of Calvinism in this first lecture, and it will come up again during the second one. But I thought in looking at or anticipating something of religious history for these talks, and as I have apologized previously, you know, it's impossible for us to include dance history, culinary history, music history, all the wonderful things we'd love to include to typify or exemplify a culture or a place or a people. And similarly with religious history, we just don't have as much time. But I looked up, because I couldn't have articulated this, what's the difference between Calvinism and Lutheranism? Calvinism being the offshoot. And it turns out, I'm reading here, Calvinism based on the belief that individuals do not have a choice on who obtains salvation because it's predestined. No one has the ability to change that. Whereas Lutheranism is founded on the belief that salvation has nothing to do with predestination, but it's acquired instead by faith. Similarly, Calvinism teaches that salvation is not possible for all people, but only for a chosen few. So there's kind of this elitist dimension, if I could use that term, to Calvinism, whereas Lutheranism teaches that salvation is attainable for anyone. And it goes on like that. So I just use this as a springboard for any of you to, you know, parse out and think about how different denominations of Christianity have such significant differences. And it's so valuable or interesting for us, let's just say, in terms of the world of Islam, trying to understand the complexity and nature of Sunnis versus Shias and the fundamentalist elements in Riyadh versus a little bit more liberal, perhaps in, you know, Marrakesh. And I use this analogy again for us to always be thinking about learning about the nuance and the subtleties that define perhaps a people, a place, but as well the historical record. Well, I'm kind of running out of time here, but I wanted to close by, first of all, recommending some books. I have to move well, I may as well just do my tulip show and tell here for you real quickly. I usually don't pick my tulips, by the way, but for you guys, I made an exception. And hopefully you can see there's some very amazing kind of little crenellated, fringy type ones over there. And here's a portion of a parrot tulip there. But let me just move to this one. This is, in anticipation of next week, I should say, this is a true parrot tulip that has that striated patterning, which was later discovered to be due to a virus. But I'm just going to turn these around and just show you that there's a nice assortment there. I didn't think they were going to last for next week, but I'll distribute those and give them away to little old ladies in the neighborhood who can enjoy them for the next couple days. So, books. Let's start out first with this one called A Fatal Journey. This was the final expedition of Henry Hudson, written by Peter Mancall, and I'll put all of these. I'll have James, our tech guru genius, put all of these online for you, so don't worry about transcribing them right now. But this book, written by a USC professor of history and anthropology, reads like a detective novel, just in terms of the shipwreck and the question of the mutiny. And the mutiny was real, but the question of whether Hudson was murdered or not, and the story about then the trial with the two survivors who were put on trial back in the UK for murder. And again, it's such an amazing story, but also to mention how there are no surviving portraits or likenesses of Henry Hudson that survive, only things that are posthumous. And that's why I included that 1880s Victorian painting there in the lecture, just because we don't actually have a real likeness of the man. But this is, again, a great, great read. Next, I mentioned in the lecture about the Hanseatic League, this important network of largely German communities, villages that came together to then trade locally sourced goods, starting out rather small with things like salt and grain and cloth and those sorts of things, but eventually expanding to include portions of far reaches of Western and Central Russia, let alone fish cod sourced from above the Arctic in Norway. All of this aside, this book here, The Edge of the World, A Cultural History of the North Sea and the Transformation of Europe, is a great place to begin for those of you wanting to read more about that Dutch history prior to the Dutch East India Company. And I just might mention also as an aside, we have a lecture on the Hanseatic League, which hopefully someday we might be able to film for you. But that lecture is a key component of not just the Viking homelands itinerary that goes between Bergen and Stockholm via St. Petersburg. It's a wonderful trip. There's also the Viking Into the Midnight Sun, I should say, and then the Northern Lights itinerary. All of those include the Hanseatic League lecture because Bergen was such an important contour, trading outpost for the Hanseatic League. Only because I mentioned Viking homelands. People oftentimes ask me, so Charles, what's your favorite Viking ocean itinerary? I kind of hate those questions because I don't want to offend anybody, but I usually say that this is how I get around it. I say, well, one of my first ones was the Viking homelands, and I've done it a number of times, and I'm actually quite partial to it. I love the fact that I think it's 8 different languages are included on that itinerary. If you look at Norwegian, Swedish, Finnish, Russian, German, Estonian, Polish, you get the idea. It's an amazing cross-cultural experience. So that's the one I love. And rivers, people often ask me, so if we're going to go on one river, which one should we start on? And again, I get around that by saying, well, the first one I was on was the Great European, the one that goes either between Budapest and Amsterdam or reverse. That one is a wonderful one. 15 days. And, nobody asks this, but in terms of what experiences would you say would be a great thing to do on a pre or post experience in Amsterdam for, one of those river trips? And of course, as an art historian, I have to say, if you've never been to the Rijksmuseum, if you've never been to the Van Gogh Museum, you should go there. But on that river strip, you go to a windmill. And again, as a teaser for our lecture coming up, seeing the inside of a working windmill is absolutely fascinating. So again, I would highly recommend that one. Only because we're talking about pronunciation of the artist that you know as Vincent van Gogh in America. Here's a funny little story. I was reminded last night, I was watching this lecture, that I was on a flight from Bordeaux to Amsterdam to change planes to come back to the US as in anticipation of filming these Dutch lectures. And there were all these Dutch words, place names and people that I didn't really know if I would have the proper pronunciation. So I hatched an idea that in the KLM lounge in Amsterdam, I thought, right, I'm going to find the most beautiful, quintessential, stereotypic blonde woman. I found this woman with a French roll on top of her head who was at the service desk, answering questions. And I went up and with my iPad, and I said, I have a question probably nobody's asked you today. And I said, I'm putting together a film on Dutch history, and I have a bunch of Dutch people and place names I'm not certain how to pronounce. Will you help me? And of course, the woman without me missing a beat kind of chuckled and said, of course. So I recorded all this. And the reason why this came up is because of Van Gogh, for example, when it came time with our production crew to film the lectures, I related this story. And one of them said,
Charles, that is the cheesiest pickup line I've ever heard. You're making a film about Dutch history and you need to learn how to pronounce Dutch words? Anyway, trust me, it's not my scene to pick up women or proselytize in airports. But anyway, it makes for a funny memory about the extent to which one tries to be accurate in putting together these talks. Well, anyway, a number of other books that I'm going to be recommending for you online. There was one that was on Google Books that is the important wonky economic history text, if you will, written by a UC California Berkeley prof that is about, it's called The First Modern Economy. It's all about the development of the Dutch East India Company. A more readable, accessible one is called The Anarchy, the East India Company, that was written by William Dalrymple and only published in September of last year. And again, the Concise History of the Netherlands from that series published by Cambridge University Press is fantastic. And I think I had one more here. Oh, for those of you wanting to learn more about the spice trade in the context of how and why the Dutch East India Company came to prominence, the two books that I'll put on that list, one of them called The Spice Route, A History, and another one called Out of the East, Spices in the Medieval Imagination. So lastly, to mention about the red sweater. It turns out all of us sailing with Viking, doesn't matter if it's on rivers or oceans, meet such wonderful people. And a very dear couple on, I think it was my first ocean trip, named Joni and Don from Orlando, Florida, were devoted listeners, attendees to the lectures and the roundtables. And Joni just assumed by wearing a red sweater that this was part of a Viking uniform. And I said, no, it just happened to be the sweater I happened to pack. And so it always got to be the tradition that if Joni was going to be on board, I'd have to be wearing my red, quote, uniform to fit the part. But anyway, unfortunately, they're not able to travel much any longer. We hope them and wish them well, and someday they might be able to join us. But again, the red sweater is for you. So with the teaser of the tulips behind me and the promise to go through the Dutch history part 2 next week, I beseech you, as you know, Reverend Charles here, don't forget to stay home, don't forget to stay healthy, keep walking, keep that good attitude going. We're going to get through this together. And of course, by all means, please keep in touch. Bye for now.